Yeah, Reinventing supply chain. We have with us today Professor Dale Rogers, Arizona State University, Professor Zachary Rogers, Colorado State University, Mani Janakiran, Senior Director Supply Chain Strategy and Data Science at Intel Corporation. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for everyone. Thank you for coming.
Nice to be with you.
Hi, Gavania.
No, good morning.
Thank you. Professor Dale Rogers, please, let's start with you, please. Geopolitics, balance of trade, competence, pandemic. Is the supply chain being reinvented by these factors?
Yeah, I don't know if balance of trade is that important. That was important to President Trump, who I never thought really understood that balance of trade doesn't really matter. Zach actually, I think, has an interesting slide about that, a PowerPoint slide, but I think it's more uncertainty. You know, if you look at the last 10 years, we've had so many big events, supply chain disruptions. The disruptions are coming faster than they ever had. Some of that's probably because of climate change, because some of them are natural disasters. But we're also seeing an interesting, kind of surprising to me, rise in nationalism, which has led to trade wars. I mean, it's not just the US and China, it was the US and Europe, it was Japan and South Korea. I mean, there's lots and lots of trade wars as there's more uncertainty, which tends to cause nations to sort of draw inwards. I know in Brazil, the Bolsonaro administration is reaching into the heart of business into what some people might say is a paranoid way. I don't want to get into Brazilian politics, which I don't totally understand, but Cavagna, your old stomping grounds, Petrobras, which is one of the great companies in the world, is all of a sudden seeing the administration put not somebody that knows the oil industry in as CEO, but somebody who's a general in the army that worked with the president. I mean, that really tells you about what's going on. So it's not just that times have been crazy here in the US and in other places, it's happening in Brazil as well. So this is causing, this uncertainty is causing companies like Intel, like Cisco, like all sorts of firms to really rethink how they structure their supply chain. So not only that you have supplier diversity, but also that you have geographical diversity to some extent because of the crazy things like what happened this week at Petrobras.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, and it really shows, I think, just to stay with your point, the vulnerability associated with overdependence. So, and that was what I think has been highlighted, Cavagna. So we have this sort of overdependence on certain things maybe coming out of China, like, things that we needed, the swabs that we needed for testing or things like that. And actually, I think on Wednesday, the Biden administration signed an executive order looking at bringing, pharmaceuticals, batteries, semiconductors. Oh, yes, sir, you have it right here, semiconductors, and also, sort of critical, minerals, essentially. And how do we get some of those back in the United States? Or even if we don't get them back to the United States, because, the dream of, we're going to start manufacturing things in Buffalo, New York again, like it's 1935, that's probably not going to happen. But even if it's something like we can diversify, so not just be dependent on one or two suppliers in the same place, but, have a network of suppliers from all over the world, that I think is more the type of realignment that we're going to see coming out of COVID and everything we've seen with
that's right.
The real issues.
Money, yeah.
I think,
money, exactly. Yeah, please.
Armando, I think the way I'm looking at it is we really have to look at a balance between globalization and localization. What I mean by that is we need to understand what are the critical things that we need to have internally, what we need to leverage externally, and then look at the whole, like a shared economy to look at what we can do better and best. And that's where different models, like we talked about localization, globalization, localization is probably something that is coming up as a better way to look at it. And another factor to understand is there are a lot of, we're talking about pandemic, we're talking about geopolitical impact, we're talking about unrest, civilization, things of that nature, right? But the whole reality is we have to, I kind of put them as, three different categories: known risk, known unknown risk, and unknown risk. So how do we react to something that we don't know? Like pandemic is a good example. But how do we quickly get our act together and plan for what we learn from it is critical. If you know something is happening, like for example, every, fourth quarter, there's going to be an uptick in demand. So plan for it. It's a known kind of risk, right? Known unknown is something a competition introduces a new product or a new market, or something happens. You don't know about it, but you can plan around it. So the supply chain need to be agile and nimble and need to anticipate so that we go from a reaction to anticipation.
And is it possible to bring back some manufacturing plants to the US, for instance, maybe for Brazil too, avoiding having raw materials and strategic source from outside?
Definitely, we have to look at different alternate plans, right? Because once you know this has happened to me before and it's going to happen to me again, the question is, I'm not going to repeat the same mistake. I need to learn from it. And what is that learning involve? And how do we go about doing that? Is it a multiple sourcing? Is it like different geolocations? All those things need to be looked at.
Yeah, the US, there's some industries like, say, defense or food production that we've always kept here because we thought, there's security reasons that we want to have those here. I think now what we're seeing, especially with the executive order you put up on the screen a minute ago, there's other pieces that are necessary, like battery technology, like information and R&D and semiconductors, and of course, medical supplies, as we saw summer.
Masks, vaccines.
Exactly. And so I think that you'll see some strategic manufacturing come back to the US where it's more about having a constant assurance of supply and less about, say, costs. That being said, we're not going to bring shoes back or something like that where it's not mission critical. But I do think those sort of A-level objects, those mission critical things, I think we could see some come back to the US or Brazil or places like that.
But you know what else? Go ahead.
Yeah, please. They only to put something more in your conversation. But costs, prices are, let's see, available to compare and to be costly, not so costly in the United States, for instance, to bring back these manufacturing plants?
Well, when you get rid of people, then it's not so costly. Intel has a lot of manufacturing in the US. Now, they don't put the sort of cheaper, higher labor stuff in the US, but there's Intel fabs here, and I don't think Intel is going to put one in China right away. I'm guessing just partly because of intellectual property issues. Manny can speak to that. But there's already a fair amount of manufacturing. Part of the problem with balance of trade is how we calculate it, and how we calculate it not just in the US but also in Brazil. So you look at the finished product like it's 100% from China or 100% from the US or 100% from Brazil, when it really isn't. The product, the iPhone that's made in China, that's assembled in China, actually has US components, and probably the biggest
Japanese,
chunk of it comes
Korean,
from South Korea and so on. And so we only measure it right at the end, and it kind of throws off the balance of trade. So there's a fair amount of stuff made here. The most important part, Manny can actually talk to this, and maybe he's not allowed to, I don't know, but you know, the in many cases the most expensive part of an Intel microprocessor is already manufactured in the US, and the downstream stuff may be done in someplace outside the US. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Manny, but it's kind of an
Probably I'm not the right person to represent and talk about that from an Intel perspective, Dale. But what I
Could you
could
talk
say
about a
is,
different
yeah, primarily, you know, like the way I'm looking at it is we are at the threshold of thinking differently. We have to probably, as supply chain professionals, need to go back to the Maslow triangle to really look at what is that we need to manufacture internally. Yes, the manufacturing of certain things have moved on and we probably don't have the skill set, but bringing it back, if necessary, is not a big deal. And then looking at it differently in terms of it is not necessarily that the labor, cheap labor is the reason why it went. It also because of the market, and also maybe because of course, the cause, you know, like I'm talking about you know, like the impact of cost and revenue also matters. But automation is another area where these kind of things can be looked at differently. So from an overall perspective, we have to have differentiation or categorization of what is that we have to have. Like Zach was indicating, from a, you know, security perspective and you know, like from a health perspective, these are certain things we have to have. And then from a technology perspective and IP perspective, it's a different category. It may not be necessarily like the healthcare, the mask, or the ventilators, but this could be the future of our country, future of our infrastructure. And that needs to be looked at as well. So not necessarily speaking for Intel, but in general, we have to really go back to that Maslow, you know, like a triangle from a supply chain perspective, look at it from the needs and wants and the criticality of where we want to go.
And you mentioned global and local, but regional isn't an option, a good option or not?
Yes, that's what I'm calling it as the localization, meaning, you know, taking the geo perspective and then looking at it locally, because if you don't have a strong local supply network infrastructure, it's going to be always dependent. It's like a hub and a spoke model, right? How strong you are going to be looking at it, what's your supply chain infrastructure look like, and then how do you grow it, and what are the critical things that you have challenges. And so those are the kind of strategically, those things need to be analyzed and trade-offs need to be managed.
Perfect. Zach, please, in a practical view, this order that was signed by President John Biden, what exactly means this in practical view?
So I think it's a lot like what we've been talking about. What they want to do is identify, hey, what are the key things that should come back to the United States, and treat them as a strategic reserve, essentially. And a big part of this too is understanding the networks behind everything. So if you look at something like critical minerals, right, like a rare earth metal, you know, China sits on the vast majority of the rare earth metals in the world. We actually have quite a few here, but a lot of them are like in a national park in California that we're never gonna drill into to find. And so, you know, it's not just, you know, I think kind of the simple way that we used to look at it is, hey, we should make phones here, or we should make computers here. But again, just like the other Dr. Rogers said a minute ago, that's only the last level. And so we need to look at things like rare earth metals, which is sort of, you know, tier 2, tier 3 behind the electronics manufacturing, because it's not just about, are we making something here? It's about ensuring a continuity of supply all the way through, especially for things that are mission critical. And as we become more reliant on, you know, communications, more reliant on battery, you know, electricity, it's going to be more and more important for us in the next 50 years to make sure that we have some base level of that here, and that we're not totally dependent on somewhere else. You know, we saw in the last century how it worked for us to be totally dependent on the Middle East for oil, for instance. That wasn't always necessarily a good thing for us. Yeah, by the same token, you know, China's ahead of us right now in battery power. I don't think we want to have another century like the last century where we're totally dependent on somebody else for energy. And so I think bringing things like that back to the United States for, security, and also honestly, there's some peace in there too, and economic development and everything. That's sort of the goal behind what that executive order was.
Yeah. Dale, please, research, the deep research, let's say the complex research and the design development is still doing in the United States. So this is the key supply chain process, part of the process or not?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. I mean, but the truth is that they're doing great research all around the world. It's so interesting. I've been thinking a lot about research. So I'm an old full professor. I already got tenure, but my son here is still in the tenure process, and the folks that he has to compete with for space in a journal is different than what I had to. So I'm almost exactly 30 years older than Zachary. And when I was going through the tenure process, I was mostly competing with Americans and some Europeans. And now Zach has to, and me too, still at my old age, but Zachary has to find space in research journals and compete with Brazilians and Europeans and Africans and Chinese and Koreans. And it's we're all we've seen the rest of the world step up their game. And it's interesting, if you go back to when Manny and I were young, and I'm a little bit older than Manny, when Manny and I were young, there was not a lot of first class research done, say in Singapore, for example. But now a lot of the semiconductor research and a lot of the really high value added processes are in places like Singapore. So one of the issues has been is that the US, who we like the cheapest, easiest solution usually, has allowed a lot of the research through sort of not great strategy to move into other places and get left behind on stuff. It's interesting. The largest battery factory in the world, and some of your listeners may have gone there with me a couple years ago on one of the Brazilian executive courses, is the Tesla Gigafactory right outside of Reno, Nevada, where Zach grew up. And the technology there is not really American technology. It's really Panasonic. It's really the Japanese were the best battery guys. Now the plant, and I'm sure refinement of the technology is happening in Nevada, but that original technology didn't come from the US. And guys like Manny, work across country borders every day, and we don't really see them as being that important in the execution of supply chains until really just recently, I think, again, where all of a sudden this is a traumatic thing. In the US, we've tended to think, well, it's way better, like Zach said, to manufacture shoes in a lower cost environment. In fact, if you look at shoes just as an example of a relatively low value, high labor content item, shoe manufacturers are moving out of China at the rate of a few percent a year. I don't know what it was in 2020, actually, but most of the last few years, it was 1 or 2%, and moving in places like Vietnam, where that's even lower cost. And so we're going to continue to see that, although countries that are strategic are going to try to repatriate very high value industries of the future. And I think what the Biden administration is trying to do here in the US is really pay attention to supply chains and have a hand in managing them, which has not really happened in the US. We just let water flow to wherever it's the best place for that water to flow. And we don't really take into consideration that much the sort of national strategic value of it, which It's interesting that the Biden administration is doing this a lot because of what happened during COVID, but also because of what happened during the Trump administration, where the Trump administration said we were vulnerable in a bunch of areas, and that's really true. If you look at the high senior management of almost any supply chain organization, they're thinking about diversity, and some of that diversity they're thinking about is geographic diversity, like where do we have things so that we're not vulnerable. We probably need a supplier of this in Asia, and maybe we need one in Mexico, because it could be that we have another. Yeah. So we're seeing a lot of really rethinking of supply chains. And part of I think the supply chain of the future is really thinking, how do we diversify and move forward? I think that's part of the strategic thinking these days.
And the next steps, Manny, for this this separation of what is strategic, what's not strategic, is the government that may take control of that, a task force of the government, or the enterprise, the private sector?
I think it should be a combination, because I remember many years ago, I was part of International Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors. It used to be National Technology for Semiconductors, and then it became international with a lot of other companies. And the whole goal of international was we had government participation, we had industry participation, we had suppliers to really look at where the industry is going, what the next challenges are. We actually were looking at the next 5 years as a near term and the next 15 years as the long term. And then there were different groups like looking at product, looking from communication perspective, from compute perspective, from storage and memory perspective, from a semiconductor, and then looking at what are the, like we were looking at metrology challenges, equipment challenges, geopolitical challenges, and then we were looking at factory challenges and placement. So the group comprising of all the semiconductor manufacturing countries were meeting on a regular basis and releasing on a yearly basis what the technology roadmap should look like, what's the guidance. And the government entities like NSF and NIST were part of that. And then IMEC from Europe, and then like from Japan, ISEMI, they were all part of the whole deal to look at where the technology is going, what the challenges are, how do we measure progress. And that was guiding the industry in some form or the other that is happening. But what I would expect is that with the, like Biden primarily indicating that semiconductor is one of the supply chains that need to be looked at, we need to go back to that mode of bringing the industry and the government and the research institutions together to really look at how the roadmap is going to operate. What are the challenges? Where do we want to evolve 5 years and 15 years from now? And then what risks and challenges we need to address. I think that is needed for us to look at.
Very interesting, this vision for the combination of the government task forces and the private sector to do this job together. Very interesting. Zach, please, Zach, can you bring to us the vision for economic prediction based on the logistics index? What's the news you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as longtime viewers of Cafe with Cavagna, no, we do the Logistics Managers Index every month, and basically what we do is we ask a bunch of supply chain professionals, director level and above, hey, transportation, inventory, warehousing, are things moving up? Are things going down? And essentially, any number below 50 indicates a contraction. Any number above 50 indicates expansion. And so we asked them, and actually this is great because we just finished the February numbers like this morning. So these are brand new.
Wow.
So, get ready to arbitrage.
This is advanced news, which will come out on Tuesday.
Yeah. So if any of your viewers want to start, arbitraging the stock market, this would be a good opportunity.
Fantastic.
So essentially the overall index was up to a 72 this month, which is really high rates of growth, the highest rates of growth we've had in about 2 years, actually. And a lot of this is driven by prices in both warehouses and in transportation. And it's because of a couple things. One is way more e-commerce and ordering things online is happening because a lot of still, even though the vaccine's coming out, we can't all go to stores. And two, there's just a backlog at the ports. The Port of Los Angeles just had its biggest January ever in 115 years that they've been measuring. So 115 years, biggest January ever. And February, month over month is going to be up over 200% from last February. And so the volume coming through is really, really high. And because the volume coming through is so high, there's a crunch on empty containers going back to Asia to be filled back up. And so we're behind schedule, which makes the supply side also behind schedule. And it's turned into this feedback loop that's really difficult to get out of. I mean, you see, routes that are normally from, Shanghai to LA rerouting to Portland or even around to the East Coast, just because it's like, well, it's not that much slower to go to Savannah. And at least that way we don't have to sit there forever. And so because of this, transportation capacity right now is, remember we said anything below 50 means contraction, is a 38, which is extreme levels of contraction, which has pushed transportation price up to an 88. So it's a 50-point difference between capacity and price. Now, to answer your question, to look at the future, we also ask our respondents, hey, 12 months out, what do you think will happen? And they do anticipate some relief in terms of transportation. So in terms of will capacity come back online, 12 months from now, they predict a 62, which means, okay, we will have some more trucks. We will see some shipping open back up. But the price, interestingly, they still predict it to be around 80 in terms of growth. So even as we bring more capacity online, prices are predicted to stay high because demand is also growing. And it seems to be growing at this moment at a faster rate than supply could possibly catch up. The situation is even more dire for warehousing, where you can build a truck fast. You can't build a warehouse fast, especially the warehouses people want that are like in the middle of a city, maybe close to consumers, so we can do same-day delivery. With those, future predictions is like a 51, so that essentially means no change. Yet price is at 82 for future warehouse. So essentially, the supply chain is going to, 83. The supply chain is going to continue to get more and more expensive because right now, demand is growing so much faster than supply, and it's going to be really difficult for us to get capacity in place. If you just look at a little part of the supply chain, like e-commerce, normally e-commerce grows 15% a year. Last year in the US, it grew about 45%. And so we grew 3%, or, we went forward in time, basically 3 years in terms of our need for infrastructure in a 9-month period. Yeah. And so we're going to be digging ourselves out of that hole, I think, for at least another year or 2 years for us to catch up and really have what we need.
And it takes time to be stable again. So
Absolutely.
It's not so easy, yeah. Okay, let's go to final comments from each one. May start with Zach, maybe Manny after, and finalizing with Dale Rogers, please.
Sure.
Zach.
Absolutely. Well, so
talking about the reinvention of the supply chain.
Yeah, no, I was just going to talk about myself for a minute. But yeah, okay, I'll talk about supply chains instead. So I think that you're absolutely, this is such a timely topic because supply chains really are changing. I mean, we've seen these periods of just crazy, fragmentation and changes in demand. And, just like the other Dr. Rogers mentioned a second ago, disruption. And I think there's really a spotlight now on the need for resilience in the supply chain. And that's what that executive order is. That's what the increased buildup in fleets is. It's all about becoming more resilient. We had this idea for so long, everything has to be JIT, has to be as cheap as possible. And of course, that's still important. But you do see now, even grocery stores are less JIT than they used to be, because it turns out, and any supply chain student, whoever has had to play the beer game would know this, it's better to have too much inventory than not enough to miss sales and really suffer from these disruptions.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Manny, please.
Oh, I just want to kind of stress the point that it has been a very disastrous 2020. We lost so many lives, and it also shook us up. But the saying is, don't let the crisis go to waste. So the big thing for us now is what did we learn from it? How do we retool ourselves? How do we look into the future so that we may not be able to anticipate what the thing like COVID is going to happen, but how do we, address these kind of things? What are the vulnerabilities? And also, we got a perfect storm of, various, like kind of a Brexit and COVID and all other geopolitical issues coming together. So the question really is, we need to get a handle on what are the things we should be doing right? What are the things we should be planning for the future? Where and how we need to be self-sufficient. We have to really take a look at our supply chain end to end and look at it from self-sufficiency, resilience, as well as our agility to respond so that we can move along.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor Dale Rogers, please to finalize.
Isn't it interesting what's happened this last year when we think about it? So not only are we redesigning supply chains and thinking about the supply chains of the future, but honestly, in the last year, we've kind of redesigned business. So think about the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic, which our mutual friend Cesar Cavagna says it didn't really get to Brazil. And of course, this epidemic, this COVID got everywhere. But think about how we responded and just think about what Zach said a little bit about the LMI and hitting some of its highest levels since we've been doing this thing. Because of our ability to go online, we're doing this little thing. You're down in Rio today, I think. You're in Rio, and Manny's in Chandler probably, and I'm in Tempe, Arizona at the university, and Zach's in Fort Collins, Colorado. And this is a very comfortable way of working. We can kind of see how we're going to have more and more ability to respond quickly because of how we can communicate and work across country lines and time zones. And I think I have way more meetings with other countries. I mean, I have more meetings. I think Manny does too, because of COVID, because you can just schedule me. When I got up this morning at 5 a.m., Zachary's mother said to me, he says, are we just 5 a.m. in the morning people now? And I said, yeah, I think we are, because there's meetings all the time. So we're really reinventing not just supply chains, but how we work.
Business.
And the response to COVID has been so different than, of course, the Black Death, the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages and the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic and all these other things, even SARS 20 years ago or so in Asia. And we're really reinventing how we're working. And 2020, I think we'll look back on as a horrible year and how many people we lost and so on, but also as kind of a reset. Isn't it something that it's February and the numbers we got for the LMI are January, the new ones that'll be out on Tuesday, and they're incredibly resilient, high active numbers where we're seeing things recover before the pandemic is over. I think Manny and I have both gotten vaccinated because we're both faculty. Manny's at Intel, but he's also teaches for us at ASU, and Arizona's prioritizing teachers like Manny and I. I don't think Zach's gotten his first shot yet, and I bet you haven't either.
We're just supposed to hold our breath.
Yeah. And so the pandemic isn't even over yet, but we're seeing record changes, a huge amount of optimism, partly because we're reinventing how we do business. And so it's not just supply chains where we're thinking about geographic diversity and all the stuff we've covered, but we're really thinking about how we actually interact with each other. You know, this is my whatever number meeting, fourth meeting of the morning. And the first one was half people were from Africa. And then the last one was a faculty meeting, which that's not that interesting actually. But you know, we're really working together in a bunch of different ways. And then we'll be done with this call and we'll move on to the next one because we can work much more efficiently than we were working 5 years ago, truthfully. So it also means that I'm really tired because you can schedule me more than you ever could. But we're seeing some really interesting things come out of this time that are going to change how we do things from here on out, I think.
Reinventing the life, not only supply chain and
Right.
businesses. Yeah, right. We appreciate having Professors Dale Rogers, Zachary Rogers, and Executive Manny Janakiran from with us today. It was a pleasure for me. And nice to meet you, Manny. It was the first
Thank
time
you.
that we are
Nice
talking.
meeting you, Armando.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
Thank
Great.
you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye,
Have a
everybody.
good
Bye now.
day. Good weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.